All right, everybody, welcome back to the Whaling Museum for another exciting lecture in our Fall 2013 Food for Thought series. This is our first lecture of our new series, and we're so excited for all of you to be joining us today. If you haven't already, please take this moment to silence your cell phones as to not disrupt the presentation. Thank you so much for supporting this free community program. We are thrilled to welcome Maryann Wasik, Executive Director of the Nantucket Lightship Basket Museum. In her role, she's responsible for overseeing the management of all aspects of the museum, and under her direction, the museum has expanded its permanent collection, increased membership, and introduced new program and lecture offerings. Before joining the museum, she was an independent consultant working with firms on technology-based business transformation projects. Maryann holds a BA in English Literature from Rutgers University and an MBA in Marketing from New York University Leonard Stern School of Business. She and her husband are year-round residents of Nantucket. So everybody please join me in welcoming Maryann Wasik.
Pleased to be here today and talking to you about what is one of my passions, which are lightship baskets and the museum. And I'm hoping that you'll come away with, after this session, an appreciation of these as true Nantucket treasures as we think that they are. We think that for a couple of reasons. Someone told me once that lightship baskets are one of the few things that are truly unique to Nantucket. And when people think about Nantucket, they think about whaling. And yes, Nantucket was the whaling capital of the world. But whaling was done in other places as well. But these particular baskets really have their origins here, were made here, and the rich history is all uniquely part of this island. And another interesting fact that I'll talk about a little bit later on is, unlike other baskets that are made from other cultures, the origins of these are very different and not as traditional as you would have expected. So with that, what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about what a Nantucket basket is, how to make one for those of you who might be interested in that, what makes a basket a good basket versus a not so good basket, give you a little bit of the history, and what all this means going forward, with a little bit of how the museum plays a role in the moving forward of these baskets. So, what is a basket? What are some of the distinguishing features? Because in order to be a Nantucket Lightship basket, it has to have some particular features associated with it. First of all, it has a nailed and lashed rim. You can see there. There's two rims actually, an inner rim and an outer rim. You can see the little nails there that go around the rim. It has very tightly woven cane. And that's interesting in and of itself because cane is not indigenous to Nantucket, and I'll talk a little bit about where that comes from and how it actually came to be part of these baskets. There's staves, which are the vertical pieces. Traditionally, they were made out of oak or other hardwoods. Today, they're made out of reed, sometimes cherry, which is also a hardwood, or other exotic materials such as baleen. It has a wooden base. That's a distinguishing feature. Oftentimes, baskets that you see have a woven base. These do not. And they're made on a mold. So how are they made on this mold? You can make a basket on any mold. Molds are traditionally made from wood, but we've seen styrofoam, glass, any kind of synthetic. So pretty much you can weave around anything, but the traditional ones are made from wood. It has an indent for the base, and there's a hole there to attach the base to the mold for weaving. Here's an example of a wooden base. So once you either make your base, you're going to attach it to the mold. There's a slot. Oftentimes people think there's two pieces of wood together that the staves are put into, but it's not. There's one piece of wood with a groove, and there's a slot made in it for the staves to go in. What you would do is cut and calculate how many you need, cut them, taper them. If you're making a round basket, it takes less tapering than if you were making an oval basket. You set your staves up on your basket. Typically what you would do would be to put them into the slot and move those all around. You typically also would wet the staves so that they are more pliable. and they often use a big band around them till they get the first courses of weavers through them, so that they don't just splay all out. Then you're going to begin your weaving. Your first weaver is about the hardest, and it takes about 1 inch per hour to weave a 6-inch basket. Once you've gotten the basket to the point where you have it as high as you'd like, it's time to take that off the mold. So you would trim your staves, you would take your rims, you'd pack everything down and make it nice and tight. You'd take your 2 finished rims, and you would set those rims, one on the inside and one on the outside of the basket. You have an inner rim and an outer rim. Then you would start to, there'd be a little space in between those 2 rims, and what you want to do there is put a piece of filler that covers up that space. You're going to put nails in. Some of them, people put them very close together, other people put them farther apart. You're going to take what they call a lashing and lash around the top of the rim, and that helps to finish the basket off very nicely. And then you're done. Well, it sounds very simple, but it's not that simple, trust me. It's much harder than it looks. And what makes a basket a good basket? Well, first of all, when you look at the basket, it has nice proportion, and I have some baskets over here, and you can see that everything has symmetry. The handles, the base, it all seems to go together, and that's important, that it looks proportional when you look at it aesthetically. The other is that your base, the woodworking, the base, the handle, the rims, they're all sanded nicely, they're finished nicely. You've had, by sanding them, you bring out the grains in the wood so you can really start to appreciate the wood. The staves are straight and they're evenly spaced, they're not crooked. The weave is tight. You can't see light through it. That's important. That it's level. It doesn't wave up and down. They're what they call no hairs. There's little strands of cane that come loose. They have to all be cut off. And then there's no bumps. When you splice 2 pieces of cane together and you don't do it properly, you're going to get a little bump in the weave, and that doesn't look very nice when you're finished. So you want to make sure that doesn't occur. And when you look at the rims are even. They're level. All the filler and lashing is tight. It's symmetrical, and there's no space between the 2 rims. So all that together, when you look at it, you'll know that it's a good basket. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the history, because Nantucket does have a history of baskets that are indigenous to Nantucket, and those were baskets that were made by the local Indian population. And those baskets, and the NHA actually does have some in their collection, are very different than Nantucket Lightship baskets. They're more traditional baskets. They're open weaved. They were made with materials that were found here on the island. They don't have a wooden base. They're woven on the bottom and typically used as work baskets around the garden or the workshop or even the house. Now, where did these baskets, how did they evolve? Well, whaling did play a very important part in that, and I'll explain that in a minute. Nantucket being the whaling capital of the world, many, many ships went out from here in explorations in far-off places. The crew that was involved with that, there were a number of different types of skills that were required, but there was one skill, there was always a cooper, or sometimes more than one cooper, on the lightships. And anyone know what a cooper does? They make barrels, that's right. And what they did is on these ships, here's an example of the barrels lined up in New Bedford, which was another important whaling port. The barrels were constructed on the ships as the whale oil was produced. And so the coopers were constantly making these barrels, and then they were filling the barrels. Now, why am I talking about barrels and not baskets? Well, I'm going to explain that in a minute. Just looking at these barrels, you may start to get the picture. Barrels have staves. They have the vertical pieces of wood. They have hoops, which are similar to weavers. They have rivets in them, similar to the nails. And they were made as they were needed, or brought on as kits and assembled as they were needed. So you take a look at this, and you say, okay, you have a lightship basket. It has nails. It has a rim similar to the hoops. It has staves, which are similar to the staves on a barrel, and a wooden base. So what our thinking is that these coopers were on these ships, and there were other seamen on the ships, and they started to think, well, we can just scale that down and make a basket in the same sort of technique, but something that could be used for other purposes other than, holding whale oil. So then it comes down to the second part that, again, is not indigenous to Nantucket, and how did it wind up being part of these baskets, and that is the cane. Well, where does cane come from, and why use cane? On these explorations, these ships were out in the Pacific, throughout Southeast Asia, in many different places, and lo and behold, they came upon this rattan palm. Now, everyone thinks that this is bamboo, but it's not bamboo. It's a vine, and it was used as dunnage or packing material between the cargo. So as the ships filled, they would pack it with this cane to keep things from moving about in the voyage. This is what it comes in looking like today, very neatly graded and sized and available. The primary use is for caning chairs, but it is exactly the same material that's used for baskets. And why has it worked so well? Well, one, it's very long. It's flexible. You can bend it easily. It has a shiny side, which looks very nice on the finished basket. It's readily available, and it's a renewable resource. It grows from 3 to 15 feet a year. So it's something that, and it was basically recycling what had its original use into something else. So between the idea of transferring the knowledge about barrel making to the basket and using materials that were part of this voyage, this is kind of how this whole thing started happening. Well, then why call it a lightship basket? Well, the reason for that has a history and a story as well. For those of you who know about Nantucket and the surrounding waters, they're very dangerous. There are a lot of shoals which ships have run aground, and it was a very heavily trafficked seafaring route between here and Europe. And there are a lot of maritime calamities out there as a result of the dangerous waters and the heavily trafficked. So something had to be done to solve the problem and reduce some of the disasters. And the solution was a lightship, which was a floating lighthouse. This ship, which was like 103-foot schooner, had 2 masts and 16 lamps on it. They started service in the mid-19th century under the lighthouse service. And there was a crew out there, and originally these crews lasted from 4 to 6 months. They were into service well into the 20th century, and at that time the service was about 6 weeks, so that was greatly compressed. And the chores out there on these ships were to clean the lamps, stand watch, keep the ship tidy, ring the bell every 2 minutes in the fog, and to cook meals for the crew. So they had a lot of time on their hands. And a lot of the original men who were on light ships were former seamen on whaling ships. So they had the means and the knowledge, and now they had the time to put these things together. Some of the best baskets that were ever made were made on light ships by men such as Reyes and Sainsbury, James, Hall. I have an example of one here by Captain James, who was on both a whaling ship and a light ship. A very well done basket. The older baskets were not signed, so you might say, how do we know this was a James basket? Well, he had a signature on the way he produced his handles. If you come up close after, you can see there's little notches in here, and when you see that, you're going to know that that's a James basket. This is a smaller one, very, very beautiful. Again, very utilitarian. It's used for holding things. Most of the homes back then didn't have big closets, so a lot of the baskets, well, that's a small one, but the larger ones were used for storing household items. They did the same thing with these baskets on the lightships that they did on the whaling ships with the barrels. They kitted them on land. They made the rims, they made the handle, they made the base. They brought all that out onto the ship, and then they did the weaving on the ship. When they were completed, they brought them back on land, and they were sold in the shops in town. The South Shoal was decommissioned, and the last baskets that were made on lightships were made in 1905. Now, lightships went well into the 20th century, but in 1905, the lightship service was taken over by the U.S. Coast Guard. And at that time, the Coast Guard said to these men, you're working for the government, you're employed by the government, and this is a form of moonlighting, making these baskets. This is a part-time job, so you need to stop doing this. So they stopped, and a lot of them then moved on. The basket making didn't stop by any chance, it moved on to land. The next kind of place where they were made in this transition, and it's not completely sequential, but one of the important points is the Coffin School, which is just off Main Street, up a little way, and they had a shop school there, manual arts. And one of the things that they made were these baskets, and they're really quite beautiful baskets if you can ever get to see one. They're small, they're very well done, and they're pretty prolific, so it's not a rarity to see them here or there, but they were made by the students in the manual training classes. Next, there was a whole group of basket makers that were evolving on land after they were no longer being made on lightships. And Mitchie Ray is one of them. He came from a long line of seamen, but he never went to sea himself. He was somewhat of a local character who wove baskets. He actually did a lot with experimenting with lids on baskets, which was interesting because up until that time, most of the baskets were made, did not have lids. And here's an example of one of his baskets. He also is known for coining this phrase, which was a label that he put on the bottom of his baskets, which really is true. I was made on Nantucket, I'm strong and I'm stout, don't lose me or burn me and I'll never wear out. These baskets are amazingly strong. Yes, a question? Okay, that's beautiful. This is a Mitchie Ray basket? That's Mitchie. This is so beautiful. And here you can see is an example of an experiment. He had this idea of the lid. He also did a few with a pagoda-type lid. This is just gorgeous.
It's signed by him on the bottom. But
Does it have the label?
No, he signed it. He
Okay.
wrote his own.
He wrote it himself.
Kind of wearing out.
Later date that he did put the label on. And it really is, this is a beautiful basket, and it's quite old, and so it has held up. We'd be happy to take it as a donation to our permanent collection at the museum. But Mitchie was the character in the group, but he wasn't the only one out there making baskets. And there are other noted post-lightship era basket makers. Chadwick was one. Bill Severance, some of you might know, was actually taught by Mitchie Ray, Fernando Silvaro, and A.D. Williams. And this is an example of a Silvaro basket. Again, little small, nice form, good shape. Not signed, again, but we kind of know that based off of the signature. This has what they call, the part that attaches the handle are called ears, and these are brass, which is an older style. Most of them are wood today, if they use them. So Mitchie was important for he was important for a lot of reasons, but one very big reason. Someone very pivotal learned from him, and that was Jose Reyes. Jose Reyes came from the Philippines. He was Harvard educated. He had a master's degree in education from Harvard. His wife's family had ties here to Nantucket, so they settled here. He did not teach and use his educational background, but somehow he, came to working with Mitchie and learned how to make baskets from Mitchie. And he was quite a prolific basket maker. He made about 5,000 baskets in his lifetime. He is probably the one person when people talk about lightship baskets, they think of Reyes baskets. But he did a couple things that were pivotal in changing this whole art form. He perfected the lid. It's no longer just a crude type of a lid. And he also collaborated with a carver, originally Charlie Sale, but other carvers after, to put a whale or a gull at times on top of the basket. And he called them friendship purses. And all of a sudden, this has changed from a household necessity to a fashion statement. And it just changed the whole complexion of what happened after that. As I said, he was very prolific, made many, many different baskets. And they have evolved tremendously from Reyes' time as well, from a functional container that we saw with some of these. This is an example, another example of a Jose Reyes basket. Has a beautiful ivory plate on the top with some carvings. It is signed with his signature. He usually put a map with his name on it. And it's a different shape. He was very experimental. He didn't stick, he made a lot of those friendship baskets, but he made many different shapes as well. And it has the plate on the inside. And this was for his wife, Mary Elizabeth Reyes, and it's inscribed in there. And this is part of the Lightship Baskets permanent collection. So this is one of our treasures. It's quite lovely. Fashion statement. Tour souvenir. You can go down in some of the shops downtown and pick up a small one. They're not considered authentic lightship baskets, but they have their place, and we wouldn't say anything other than that. If you want to have something that looks like this and you don't want to have to make the commitment of the investment, and it works for you to use for flowers or whatever on your table, that's great. As an art object, because they really are works of art, and as a piece of our history. And here are some examples of some of the baskets that are being made today by some of the contemporary basket makers. As you can see, they are constantly pushing the limits of what can be done. Today, there are 10 to 12 full-time basket weavers on Nantucket. And when I say full-time, that's how they earn their living, by putting food on their table by making baskets. But there are literally hundreds of hobbyists. And the way that came into being is that years ago, some of the teachers become teachers and started giving lessons. And what they did for their students was that they made some of the parts, similar to when they were kitting things before they took them onto the lightship. They would make the base for the student, they would make the handle, they would make the rim. So now the basket maker doesn't have to be a woodworker to be able to make a basket to completion. So the basket maker does the weaving, and the teacher was doing the woodworking component of it. And that still happens in some cases today. Additionally, there are suppliers that make these things that people can buy. So it's opened up the door for people to make baskets who normally wouldn't want to learn about how to use a lathe or how to use a belt sander or the kinds of tools that are being used to do the woodworking piece of it. And here's an example of a present-day basket maker. This I'm sure you've heard of, Michael Caine. This is of rosewood on the top, and all carved with little seahorses. And the seahorse theme goes here. And as you can see, again, it's basically a friendship purse, similar to the Reyes purse, but it has added different elements to it, the overlay of the ivory onto the handle, the interesting little footwork, the carvings on the base, trying to embellish. And it's changing, it's evolving all of the time, because there are people out there experimenting. The clutch, which is the piece that's in the middle, a different form of a handbag. Household items like the ice bucket or that large piece, which is a sewing basket. miniatures. There's a whole group of things that can be made in miniature form as well. And the latest trend seems to be in the area of jewelry, where there's bracelets and necklaces and earrings that are made in that basket weave tradition. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the museum and the role that we see ourselves playing in this evolving history. Basically, we feel that our mission is to help to preserve this history and to tell this story over and over again, so that people understand how it integrates and how important it is to the overall history of Nantucket. Supporting a learning of this art form by mentoring new generations of basket makers. And well, how do we do that? Well, we have, we try to help the existing basket makers out in terms of making some of the things that they're doing visible to the public. We have a program with children that I'm going to talk about in a minute that we're very, very proud of. But the museum, for those of you who haven't been there yet, it's a fairly new museum. We're not anywhere near as old as the Whaling Museum. We were started in 1998. This is our 14th exhibit. The exhibit changes every year, and we're open seasonally from Daffodil to Columbus Day. So Saturday is our last day. If you haven't been there, please come visit us. There's 2 full-time staff, and there's 30 volunteer docents and demonstration weavers who give a tremendous talk for visitors. And we have 2 of our long-standing docents sitting right in the front row, and they're fabulous. We love having them there. And I can't tell you enough about our volunteers because we couldn't do it without them. And we have approximately 50 baskets in our permanent collection. Here's a sampling of 4 of them. The 5th one is not part of the collection. I'll explain that in a minute. But that's growing little by little. So it's just a 5-minute walk from Main Street, and it's really quite a gem. This is an example of the inside of the museum. We have Jose Reyes' workshop. The family donated that workshop to us. He had it on York Street, and so it's been reconstructed in the museum, almost to scale. And it's really quite amazing to see, first of all, the small space that he worked in, and also some of the very basic tools that he used to make literally 5,000 baskets. We have a youth weaving program. We touch about 56 children a year, year-round, with the program. This is an example of one of our students' baskets. In a 6-week class, they do complete a basket. It's hard to get them to give them to us to display because they don't want to part with them, but I was able to get a hold of this. And they're really quite lovely. The children absolutely adore making these things. We've had a number of students go on to higher levels. We have one right now who's actually helping as an assistant instructor with the younger children. And we have another former student who's helping to fund her way through college making baskets, and some of them are sold in some of the downtown shops. So carrying on that tradition. We're also working on possibly doing a scholarship program for some of the children who show some particular talent, where they would go into one of the basket weaver shops and start to learn the woodworking component of it. So we want to get them exposed to that as well. But I think Jose Reyes said it best when he said it makes him proud to contribute to perpetuating an art of part of Nantucket that should not be lost. And that's how all of us at the museum feel, too, that we are contributing to perpetuating that art that we really feel is so important to this history of this island. With that, I'll take any questions that you might have. Yes. Mitchie was in the teens and 20s. No, it is a separate museum similar to this Life-Saving Museum, which is a separate museum, yes. The NHA does have a fabulous collection of lightship baskets, and they are very generous to us in helping us. As a matter of fact, some of their collection is actually at our museum. We, as I said, have 50 baskets, so we rely heavily on people to loan us baskets for each year's exhibit. So oftentimes you'll see things that have never been exposed to the public before. was sort of a tradition that was taught and carried on. We know for sure he taught Bill Severance. We know he taught Jose Reyes. It's not clear who learned, from whom. There's other connections there, so I wouldn't say he was the first. And again, a lot of this is just piecing things together. It's not written down in a neat little space so that you can kind of figure it out. Other questions? Yes, Tony. Was there a question back there? Yes. Yes. Well, no, other people have done it, but as we understand it, Bill learned from Mitchie Ray, and Bill as a young boy, and he was in Mitchie's shop, and Mitchie said to him, "You need to figure out a way that people can differentiate your baskets from my baskets." And that's when Bill put the penny in. Now, we have seen examples of his work without the penny, but for the most part, he has the penny with the year that the basket was made. And, we've heard stories where if doesn't have a penny, it's not a Nantucket basket. If it's not made on Nantucket, it's not a Nantucket basket. But we say if it has the elements of the base and the handle and the mold, it is a Nantucket basket. It doesn't need a penny. It doesn't need to be made specifically here. As a matter of fact, in Japan, there's a huge Nantucket basket making population. And we see many visitors who are basket makers who come specifically to see what's the exhibit and to show us what they've made too. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. This past year, the one that we're winding down on is Coming Home. And what we did was we sourced baskets from several collectors off island. And so we brought some baskets back here that hadn't been here in many, many years. I'm trying to think. Last year we had, one year was from folk art to fine art, so we tried to show the transition. One year we had an exhibit just on nests. And I think next year, the 14 exhibit is going to be focusing on 21st century baskets to try to show where this is going. Any other questions? Well, I encourage you to take a look at these. Better not to touch, but take a look, come up close. Thank you very much.